Right hand, wax off, left hand, wax on, wax off, breathe in through the nose, out the mouth. Week 2 of Blender. I'll go through these 9 principles, talking about what I made last week and things that I learned. First, I put this animation together, a ball that falls off this space, and then it hits dominoes, but they were the tips of swords. It's not a full Rube Goldberg contraption. And the thing that made his illustrations interesting is he would have this contraption to actually do something. The Back to the Future intro, the first scene in Back to the Future shows something similar to this, where there's this contraption that is opening up a can of dog food. Back to this Blender thing. First principle here is just fundamentals. That's why I started this episode with wax on, wax off. You might want to be a little more direct with the movement itself, because he was like waxing the car, and then I think he ends up like painting the fence. Eventually, he learns that Mr. Miyagi was trying to kind of like teach him something that would like teaching him skill transfer. So he practiced like that movement, like left and right and up and down, and then realizes, oh yeah, that's going to help me with defense in karate. You can also just like, I think he had to be like convinced that the basics are important instead of just practicing the direct movement. So in the movie, there's a reason that he doesn't just start him with the movements, because Daniel-san thinks it's boring and he wouldn't practice those basic movements for hours a day. And that's something that I really enjoyed. I'm doing the CG Fast Track tutorial. The first one I did was the Minecraft tutorial from last week. This time it's a longer tutorial, or maybe it's just more difficult, so it's just taking me longer. But it's creating a sword and then doing the lighting and that sort of thing. But I'm only I think there's 5 sections of it, and I'm only through 2 of the sections. So the first one was making the sword, and then the top of the sword, just like the tip, the edge, I guess it would be the blade. And then the second part is making the guard and the handle. Still working through that. But part of what I really like about these tutorials, this course, is the emphasis on, they'll call out things like, hey, this movement that you're doing, repeat it a few times, repeat it 5 times, and it would probably be worth it to repeat it more times. Just from the Minecraft one, it was like selecting objects and then centering around those so that you orbit around those things. And then same thing with doing basic like extruding a shape. And I have a better sense of what basic movements and like keyboard shortcuts I'll need, mouse movements and that sort of thing. And just repeating that over and over and over so that I stop thinking about it in Blender. That's been really good so far. Principle number 2, active recall. Active recall is where you're studying, you see the question, and then you do active recall. You fill in the blanks, you answer the question. This helps you, instead of just like rereading something, it can be better to find the gaps, then read the parts that you don't remember. Same thing with tutorials. And this is also encouraged by CG Fast Track. You do a tutorial and then try to repeat and recreate the same thing without following the video. Aim for finishing 70% of it without having to refer to anything else. These days, memorization is sort of underrated because you can just look everything up. But the less you have to look stuff up, the more you can stay in flow. It doesn't have to be a complete flow when you're working on things. Hard work means that you won't be in flow, but you do want to stay focused and on task. Opening a browser window to look something up can knock you out of that, especially for the basics. The less stuff you need to stop and look up, the better active recall will help you do that. So follow the tutorial, try to redo it on your own. There's the illusion of the tutorial in a few different ways. One of them, you create that output, then you think maybe that, oh yeah, now I can do other output. That won't be too hard. The other illusion is that you'll just think, well, yeah, I'll remember all these steps. There are some steps that seem pretty basic that you think you won't need to look up again, but I end up looking up this stuff all the time. Principle number 3 from this Rube Goldberg contraption, skill transfer. As I'm learning Blender, there are some things though where I do think, oh, I'm going to remember how to do that. And then I do. I don't have to repeat the steps over and over. I just remember it. And it's drawing from muscle memory from other things that I'm very comfortable with or somewhat comfortable with. If I can relate something to Figma, 2D UI design, then that's very easy for me to remember. If I can relate it to After Effects, that's harder. I'm not very experienced with After Effects, but it helps me with learning, especially for things like basic keyframing of set something up, set a camera up here, insert a keyframe, move it somewhere else, and then insert a keyframe, and understanding that, then the camera will move from here to here to here. That's something I understand, but the specifics in Blender, or understanding what object I need to select sometimes, or understanding how selecting multiple objects will work, that becomes a little tricky because I have some mental model from particularly Figma of thinking about like how properties apply and how this will apply to groups and that sort of thing. It's rarely as simple as that seems in Blender, like selecting multiple things and then trying to apply material in the details panel. Sometimes it seems like it's doing things across all the selections. Sometimes it's only the last thing that you selected or the first thing. So I'm getting used to that, and I think that just will take repetition. Then some things, if I can relate it to code, I've been a professional programmer in my life, doing very basic JavaScript. I can relate the concept from Blender to something from code, or just like understanding components and variables and these numbers and sliders and that sort of thing. In principle, for distractions look like good things. Quick story about Warren Buffett's pilot, and I think that is not actually true, but makes for a good story. He asked Warren Buffett how to focus. He's told, write down 25 things that you want to do right now, 25 goals that you have right now. It might take a little bit of thinking. Maybe you get to 20. The exact number doesn't matter. You write 20, circle the top 5. Great. Now you have 15 distractions. You have these great things that you want to do, and you can get distracted by the good things. Relating that to Blender and going through these courses, I need to remember to stick to the courses and work through them. Don't get me wrong. You want to have something else that you're applying it to. It helps make the knowledge stickier, but there can be too much like experimenting as well. I get the urge to go and experiment, have fun, make things that I like, and apply things in the tutorial. When the tutorial gets hard, when the course gets hard, once it's going to introduce like a new concept that's going to take quite a bit of focus, that's where I'm like, let me just go make another kind of sword. What I've been finding is eating up a lot of time is trying to animate things and then trying to animate the camera. I haven't done any like proper tutorials on understanding how the camera works, understanding really how animation works. Like, it can be fun to do that, but also it takes a lot of time to set it up, watch it, render it. I'm probably doing it in an inefficient way right now. It's not the time to learn that. That said, it's fun. So it's balancing that out based on having fun with this and learning. The tutorials themselves are pretty fun as well. It's more fun to model a sword than to model a table, but it becomes easy to justify not working through the course by saying, it's a good thing that I'm applying what I'm learning to my own project so I can make these shorts. But the ratio might be off. In the very beginning stages, maybe something like 80% of the time working through the course, building the fundamental skills, and then 20% of the time trying to apply it to my own stuff. Right now, the actual time is probably more like 30% doing the course and then 70% trying to do my own things, which again can be good, but there is just like a lot of time where I thought, oh, cool, I have a sword. Now I'm going to draw on it. And then it took maybe an hour before I was able to get the thing exported in some way, get the texture exported in some way so that I could draw on it properly, draw on my iPad and bring it back in and use it as a texture. So second one was this tutorial where I was working on the blade of the sword. And then my side project thing was creating the Buster sword from Final Fantasy VII. And that brings me to this principle, the 3% rule. This is something from Virgil Abloh. He passed away in 2020, but he was a designer, worked with Nike. That's how I learned about him. I'm not huge into shoes, but a bunch of my friends are. I started to notice like, they're getting these sneakers with red tags on them. He talks about, for some of his projects, he sees himself as an editor. He uses the 3% rule. He takes something that exists and then modifies it by 3%. So the original essence is there, but he's trying to inject a little bit of his own style on it. With Blender I think this can be a good with learning from tutorials. Take the tutorial and make 3% of it your own. After you've done it, following the tutorial step by step, go to one of the steps, and then if it told you to put in some value, tweak that value to the extremes to understand how that works. And maybe with the end result, you have something adjacent that you have in mind that you can try to create. So I'm making a sword. I know how to extrude. I can make this sword shape. I can make this blade. The iconic blade that comes to mind for me is the Buster Swords. Principle number 5, tracing. In the tutorial, you are literally bringing a 2D outline of a sword in so that you can learn to select edges and add sections to the shape and then extrude and move different things to trace this 2D outline of the sword handle. So it's sort of like vector drawing for the first time. It's very similar. You want to trace this shape with a bunch of points, but it ends up different from working with like better curves. So you see the dots, you need to connect the dots, but there's a specific way to select the dots, like grabbing with like the rectangle, the draw selection, the rectangle selection, instead of clicking the dots specifically. As a beginner, apprentice, novice, whatever, tracing is important a thing because then you can have some master, some teacher show you something to trace. Tracing allows you to practice the movements without having to think about other things, whatever you're trying to learn. Tracing, rebuilding something that exists already. Everyone wants to create something completely original. It's difficult if you don't first learn the fundamentals. Learning the fundamentals is faster if you are rebuilding something that exists so that you can focus on just learning the technical skills. Okay, principle number 6, add-ons and extensions. So the nice thing with the Buster Sword, it's from Final Fantasy VII. This reminds me of Materia, where you're able to equip different things, and that a little bit is the mental model that comes to mind when going through the tutorial, going to something like the subdivision modifier. It's like adding that on, and you can combine it and do 2 subdivision modifiers. And one of them is the basic one, and the other one is the Catmull Clark. One, this idea of you have something and then you can modify it, select the shape of the handle, take half of it, and then mirror the other side. Principle number 7, write in the editor. I'm trying to get to where I can use Blender for everything it's made for, like editing textures. Right now, I still feel the urge to take things out of Blender to do stuff. As I mentioned, I'm trying to be able to just like paint on the object. I got that to work to make this a set of swords. I learned to like separate the faces and have them as a texture image. Then I brought that into Figma to try to just write text on it first, and was able to bring that in again after much trial and error. A lot of that trial and error was trying to learn to paint on it directly in Blender first. Eventually I realized like, I have a material and a texture on this thing. And I think it was like I was trying to paint on one, but it was actually like trying to paint on the other. I forget. I need to figure that out. The idea of write in the editor comes from Seth Godin. It's this blog post. So he writes a blog post every single day about marketing. He's done it for 10 plus years, sends it out as his newsletter. He writes directly in the blog editor. I think he used to use TypePad. Now he uses WordPress. He does his writing in there, and he knows when he's in that editor exactly what kind of post he's writing. He's not ideating for other platforms. He knows that editor is where he goes to write his blog posts. For me, I want that to be Blender. When I'm in Blender, I can paint the objects, animate the objects, all these different things. Hopefully I'll get there. Principle number 8, trust the system. If someone that has more knowledge than you in something outlines a system, then it's probably a good idea to follow it, especially if they've taught it to a lot of other students and those students have gone on a successful path. The system probably works, trust it, and then stay on it. That goes back to me with the course and the tutorials. Like, I need to show some grit, continue to work on them, because I do trust that these tutorials are good. They'll get me to a certain skill level where I'll be able to make really interesting things. Right now, I feel like I can already make stuff that is interesting to me and I'm having fun making it, but I don't want to stop there. I think if I can continue on, get a little more skill, I'll be able to make even more interesting things. Eventually, there will be a module or another course in their set of courses that will teach me animation properly, that will teach me camera and lighting things properly. What this reminds me of, I am consistently on a fitness journey and I don't trust the systems. It's program hopping in fitness. You start something, it's exciting for 3 or 4 weeks. You don't stick to it. You don't get the results. Try another system and repeat. It's easy to trust a system when it's early on. Everything is exciting. I'm learning new skills rapidly. Last principle, diminishing returns of debugging to learn. When programming, you'll run into bugs and then you will try to fix it. You learn how to fix it, and then now you have that knowledge that's stickier. That's great. Debugging is great for learning, but oftentimes there's diminishing returns of how long it takes you to learn the fix to the bug. A rule of thumb I learned, try to debug it for 30 minutes, then ask someone more experienced where you know that they'll know the answer. The 30 minutes helps you build some base understanding of what's going wrong, and maybe you can fix it in that time. But after 30 minutes, you're probably going in circles at that point. I need to have a rule like that as well. I'm going to try to draw on this sword for 10 minutes so that I don't waste 90 minutes. I was trying to look up different videos to follow. Then finally, I looked something up and someone said, oh, you probably just have a texture and material. You need to turn one of them off. And that's what the answer was, just this thing I had no idea about. That hour instead could have been spent going through the course. Now, I think I've recorded for too long, but yeah, I'm going to start week 3, going to continue to work through the course. Hopefully I'll have like that full sword at the end. Thanks for checking this out.